Welcome back. We're having a real family conversation today and asking who's Black enough. There's so much here to untangle, and I sat down with some folks to help us unpack this issue. Joining me in this conversation now, Tanya Kateri Hernandez, author and professor of law at the Fordham University School of Law, and Tariq Nasheed, author, filmmaker, and social commentator. Thank you both for being here. So how much of Blackness has to do with this shared African-American experience, like your Black card, so to speak?
This is why we now have a movement, the Foundational Black American Movement, instead of using the term African-American. And we're now saying, hey, if you are going to claim Blackness, what type of Blackness are you claiming? Because sometimes people claim Blackness in a conditional context. They are Black when they can get something out of it as a minority. And when it's time to get some other benefits from the dominant society, they will distance themselves from Blackness.
Who has the right to designate someone's Blackness? So, for example, if Amber Rose wants to self-identify as Black or as biracial, who has the right to tell her she's not?
Well, the ethnic group in question, they have a right to do that because for a long time, and there's interviews online where Amber Rose is going out of her way to make very clear she's not a Black woman.
I do not consider myself a Black woman. Absolutely not.
She just was very, very clear. I am not a Black woman. I'm not a Black woman. And now, well, I'm kind of sort of Black. I'm kind of sort of Black. We don't get to pick and choose when the day is right for Blackness. We have to deal with systematic white supremacy and anti-Black racism on a daily basis. So that's the thing that brings us together. That's our common ground.
Of course, we're coming off this conversation that Jocelyn Hernandez has been having publicly. And one of the things that has been raised is the issue of Afro-Latinos and their claim to Blackness, so to speak. So Tanya, I would love to read you some statistics when it comes to kind of how a lot of Latinos view themselves. So a Pew survey found that about 3 in 10 Afro-Latinos selected white as their race, 25% chose Black, and 23% selected, quote, some other race. So do you think that some Latinos want to distance themselves from Blackness?
Well, I mean, I think that first we need some clarity about Latinos. They're a pan-ethnic grouping.
What is the factual distinction between Latinos and those who consider themselves to be Hispanic? And then, as we all know, when you're filling out those forms, it'll say Hispanic, non-white. Within Hispanic, there are racial separations. So help us understand that.
First thing to keep in mind is that Latinidad, Latinos are not a race group unto themselves. They may experience racialization to the extent that, you know, they get harassed by police based on their Latino surname. And so in that respect, it's not just like being any other immigrant group because they're being treated as an undesirable other. But nevertheless, Latinos come from locations in which we have Blackness and whiteness and indigeneity, right? That is to say, when some of those Latinos are picking white, it's because they're straight up white. They look white, they sound white, they're whitey white. And they would be white in their countries of origin, and they're white here too. But I want to be very clear. We have white people in Latin America and the Caribbean, and they don't become really non-white by being here. One, the slave ships didn't just stop here in the United States. In point of fact, historians say that only 3.5% of the transatlantic slave trade, the 10.7 million people who survived the Middle Passage, only 3.5% of them were brought to the what we now call the United States. Whereas the rest, 90%, were looking at the Caribbean and Latin America. Part of the confusion, of course, is that in trying to have social justice movements across decades that bring many people together, a rainbow coalition in the Jesse Jackson, frame of things, Latinos have been invited to be people of color. That's a beautiful thing, right? To talk about all Latinos as one thing hides the ways in which Afro-Latinos statistically across jurisdictions or locations have much more in common from a socioeconomic perspective with African Americans and other people of African descent, Haitians, Africans, etc., than they do their fellow Latinos. I look at all the ways in which the Afro-Latino subject is not like other Latinos in the research I did for the book Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias, because it's very systematic and has structural components.
So, Tariq, do you think that there needs to be a distinction between those whose ancestors came off the boat in the United States of America and those who came off the boat in other places? Is that really the common denominator when it comes to Blackness?
It should be the common denominator, but what's interesting, a lot of these other groups who come here as immigrants, they make a distinction themselves to other themselves away from us. The same anti-Black racism and segregation that we have here to a certain degree. When you go to certain Latin American countries, the Black people are on this side of the island or the country, and the lighter ones on this other side of the country. So that whole medular la raza mindset that's down there in South America and Central America and Latin America, we can't allow that to happen here. And this is why we're saying we're going to draw.
Explain that. What is that?
Every Latina needs a white boy. Yes, I said it.
Absolutely not. Mejorar la raza is declined.
There's a saying in Latin American culture, mejorar la raza, mean improve the race, mean whiten up the race. Mean if you mate with somebody, get with somebody lighter so that the race can be lighter.
Now, so far in this conversation, we've really been talking about self-identity, how we identify racially. But we all know that race is a social construct. In most cases, it is the world that identifies us as a particular race based on how we look. Tariq, is this even something that people have power or control over? Or will we be identified the way that the world sees us based on how we look?
We speak about Jocelyn and Amber Rose having their argument, and Jocelyn was telling her about her not being Black enough. What's interesting, when Jocelyn got arrested after one of those reality TV show fights, her mugshot and her jail record popped up online. Jocelyn herself is classified as white on her own paperwork. So there are a lot of dark-skinned Afro-Latinos who will sit there and classify themselves as white, just like the other people in Latin American society.
Tanya, I'm curious to your thoughts on that.
We all got a big fight across the globe. And here's another thing, when we think about ourselves in isolation geographically, just the Black people of the US, just the Black people of Venezuela, and so on and so forth, is that how we may disadvantage ourselves by not having the same number of fellow travelers, right, to help us in the fight.
We do have a right to say, hey, we don't want that person speaking for us. That person is illegitimate when they try to speak on Black issues, because they're not going to speak in our best interest because they have dual allegiances to other cultures. See, that's the thing that we have even with Latino society. When they come around us, everything is kind of ratchet and everything is kind of degraded. Just like the Love and Hip Hop crowd, many of them are Caribbean and Afro-Latino. They act a certain way around us and put that under the banner of Blackness, which is a degenerate type of behavior. But when they go to the Latin Music Awards or they do anything culturally Latin, everybody's on their P's and Q's. Everybody's not doing anything that's derogatory or something that's going to make the whole Latin community look bad. So we have issues with that.
So then where does that leave, say, someone like Clarence Thomas or Candace Owens, people who are unquestionably visually Black, but who a lot of people would question their allegiance to the Black community?
I have to keep reminding you that I don't want to be a part of this culture. I want to destroy it.
Candace Owens has identified as Caribbean. She has said over and over, her family, I think they're from St. Thomas somewhere, part of the family. So she has many times identified as Caribbean and talked about how successful Caribbeans are over Black Americans. So she has a dual allegiance, and this is why she cannot be a spokesperson for us. This is why she goes out of her way to undermine Black society. And Clarence Thomas, he's somebody who's just an old school, what we call a Sambo.
Sorry, go ahead, Tanya. I'm going to give you the last word.
I would just simply say that, Tariq, we actually are identifying them, but we don't get the platform, meaning the white Latinos, right? That they command a lot of space. All the same race hierarchies that you hear in English in the United States exist within Latin American and Latino communities as well. And so that's, I think, another way in which we can sort of lose sight of how much we have in common, because we're getting subsumed as if we're the same as all these white Latinos or the wannabes, as opposed to the straight up Afro-Latinos who have been very clear all along about who they are, but the white Latinos don't want to give us the time of day.
But here's the thing, sister, there are a lot of people in these Latino organizations that they've never called out the George Zimmerman. They've never called out Officer Yanez, who killed our brother up there in Minnesota. They're not calling out Enrique Tarrio, the guy from the Proud Boys, who's a Cuban who looks an Afro-Cuban. You have another Latino, Nick Fuentes, who's a suspected white supremacist running around here, and nobody from the Latino community, they're not saying anything about these people. So it's up to us to draw the line in the sand and say, hey, there's a problem over there that you guys have to deal with before we get into this whole minority coalition thing.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Tanya and Tariq, thank you both very much for your time.
Next up, we're heading to a place where Black men can lay their burdens down. Find out about this safe space when we come back.